I love that description at the end there. They saw the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed, their robes were not scorched, there was no smell of fire on them. It's kind of little comment that gives this the ring of an authentic eyewitness account, it seems to me. And yet this is maybe one of the most astonishing miracles we read of in the Bible. Difficult to get our heads around how it actually happened, and yet Daniel tells us that it did happen. Reminded me of those words in Isaiah, written sometime before this happened. Maybe Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego knew of these words from Isaiah 43. This is what the Lord says, He who created you, O Jacob, He who formed you, O Israel. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I've summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned, for the flames will not set you ablaze. For I am the Lord, your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Saviour. Now normally, and quite rightly I think, we spiritualise those verses, saying that really it's our souls that God promises to protect, that it's our salvation that is assured no matter what happens, whereas we can't expect God to save us from all physical danger. But here in Daniel we do see an instance of a literal outworking of that promise made in Isaiah, reminding us once again in this book that nothing is impossible with God. There's that intriguing aspect as well about the appearance of a fourth person in the furnace, one like a son of the gods. Some see this, along with other instances in the Old Testament, as maybe a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus, even. Well, I mean, whatever we think about that specific point, surely in some way this was a fulfilment of God's promise, not just to protect those who place their trust in Him in the face of danger, but also to be with us, beside us even, in person, through everything we face in life. Do you remember that great verse near the beginning of Joshua? Be strong and courageous, do not be terrified, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. So going on from that, there are three things in particular I want to draw out of this account from the book of Daniel. Firstly, to see this as an inspiring example of a passionate commitment to God and to faith in Him. Secondly, to recognise in this a mature attitude to prayer, especially when we're faced with weighty matters of life or death indeed. And then third, to look into this a bit further as a dramatic illustration about that promise from God to be with us in everything. So first, it's an example of a passionate commitment to God and to faith in Him. Because surely that's one thing we see here from Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. I mean, this is no run-of-the-mill situation, is it? Their lives are on the line here, literally. And yet their faith in God is so strong, so real, so vital to them that absolutely nothing is going to cause them to compromise their faith. These are people who, I think we could say, live and breathe their faith. It's so ingrained within them, so much a part of them, that there's just no way they're going to deny it, even in these extreme and absolutely terrifying circumstances. They're passionate about and they are totally committed to God. And we can say we see that same passion and commitment from many others in the pages of the Bible. Read in the New Testament through the Acts of the Apostles, and it's full of examples of Christians who are ready and who sometimes do give everything, give their lives for Jesus. And we might ask ourselves this morning, well, where has that kind of passion and commitment gone? Does it still exist today? I came across this quote this week from an Episcopal priest named Robert Capon, if you've heard of him, who says this: the most critical issue facing Christians today is not abortion or pornography or the disintegration of the family or moral absolutes or drugs or racism or sexuality. The critical issue facing Christians today is dullness. Dullness. We have lost our astonishment. The good news is no longer good news, it's okay news. Christianity is no longer life-changing, it's life-enhancing. Jesus doesn't change people into wild-eyed radicals anymore. He changes them into nice people. What happened to radical Christianity, the unnice brand of Christianity that turned the world upside down? What happened to the category-smashing, life-threatening, anti-institutional gospel that spread through the first century like wildfire and was considered by those in power as dangerous? What happened to the kind of Christians whose hearts were on fire, who had no fear, who spoke the truth no matter what the consequence, who made the world uncomfortable, who were willing to follow Jesus wherever he went? And he makes a brave statement. He says, I'm ready for a Christianity that, in inverted commas, ruins my life, that captures my heart and makes me uncomfortable. I want a faith that is considered dangerous by our predictable and monotonous culture. Well, we might question some of the words and phrases he uses perhaps, but hasn't he got a point? And yet, around the world, there are still today many Christians who show great passion and commitment to God, even under extreme circumstances. I thought I'd read again some comments from an interview. I read this in an evening service a couple of months ago, but it's an interview with an Iranian woman called Sharla, and the article is entitled, Jesus Came to My Prison Cell and Told Me Not to Be Afraid. The article starts by describing as she grew up in a Muslim household in Tehran, Iran. But then she went, I think in her late teens, on a 2-week holiday to London. And on the last day, somebody gave her a John's Gospel. And she was converted. She became a Christian. Gave her heart to Jesus, as she says. And when she got back, she started to share her faith with friends. And some of them began to accept that she was now a Christian. But it then goes on to say, I'll start reading, but in the following years, the persecution of Christians in Iran worsened. Charlotte explains, the government was scared of people coming to Jesus. One person told me they'd prefer young people to be involved in drugs than be Christians. One evening, Charlotte's openness in her evangelism landed her in trouble with the authorities. They demanded to know who else had been spreading the Christian message. But Charlotte refused to turn in her fellow believers. They interrogated me. They wanted me to tell them the names of other people who were evangelizing. I didn't talk to them, and they put me in prison. She was thrown into a tiny, dirty and smelly cell in Iran's notorious Evin prison. Solitary confinement implies she was completely alone. But that's not how Charlotte would describe the experience. She begins by saying, I was so afraid and crying, sitting on the floor of the cell, saying, why am I here? Why have you brought me here? I was working for you. She's praying. A few hours later, after I came to prison, Jesus came to my cell. I saw his face. He said, Charlotte, don't be afraid. I am with you. His voice was so peaceful. His face was full of love and peace. I couldn't believe my eyes and said, Oh Lord, however many years you want me to stay here, I'm ready now. I stopped crying and was so happy. I was sure that he was with me. And he was with me all the time. He never left me alone. This message wasn't just for me, it's for each one of us. When we're in need, we can hear his voice saying, I am with you. After 4 months of solitary confinement, she was moved to be with 40 other prisoners. She shared the gospel with everyone she came into contact with. And today she reports that 10 people came to Christ. One person was even baptized in the shower. Jesus told me to follow him, and I followed him. I went to Evin, and I followed him there. Many people were going to Evin. Some have been there for a whole life sentence. So maybe there would not be another opportunity to hear this message unless I was there. Some have heard the message and not accepted, but I'm still praying for them. I believe one day they'll give their hearts to Jesus. And then there's a description about the way she says miraculously, was released from prison and found her way to Europe, 2013. But she now edits a magazine, Elam Ministries, a Christian charity aimed at strengthening and expanding the church in Iran. So this is sent to people in Iran, and it's a country she still is still home for her. She longs to return. Finishes by saying, I'd really like to go back to Iran because my family, friends and memories, everything is there. I'm praying something happens so I'm free to go back to Iran to continue my evangelism there. I know many people are thirsty to hear this message. If I'm going back to Iran, I want to go city by city, find people and tell them about Jesus and about his joyful message. This is my dream and I pray for it to come. An example of somebody not only holding on to her faith, but really living out her faith in an amazing way. And again, Jesus, at least convinced that Jesus was there with her through it all. And we need to look at our own Christian lives, don't we, alongside such passionate and committed people. And well, no, we're not in the same situation. We're not facing the same kind of danger from persecution. We have to be thankful for that. We also have to ask ourselves then, well, so how should our passion and commitment be showing itself in our lives where we are and what we're doing? Or maybe even before that, we need to be on our knees before God, asking him to give us just a measure maybe of the kind of passion and commitment that we see in people like this. So that's the first point. The second point, we see here a mature attitude to prayer, I've called it. And I think it has to be one of my favourite moments in the Bible, where Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego reply to the king. It's the only thing they say, or that we hear them saying. And they said, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into a blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it and rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, very respectful, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. They believe God is able to save them, even from this fiery furnace, that he's capable of doing that. And yet they don't presume he will do that. Whether it means living or dying, they're going to continue serving God, continue doing what they believe he wants of them. Because God doesn't save everyone from death in such situations. Even in the Bible, that doesn't happen. You remember that wonderful story about Peter in Acts chapter 12 it is, that miraculous escape from prison. He's been arrested and he's under threat of death, and we read about the other believers praying earnestly that he might be released, and in due course, and in fact much to their own astonishment, if you remember the story, he is quite miraculously released from prison and freed. But let me remind you how that chapter 12 of Acts begins. We read this: it was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, brother of John, one of the 12, put to death with the sword. When he saw that this pleased the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. And the story then continues. Don't you think the believers must have been praying just as earnestly for James? They must have been. And he wasn't saved. Thinking of Daniel's friends being saved from death by fire reminded me about that wonderful account of Polycarp's death. I've read it before, I know, but I always love reading it again. myself. He was a Christian bishop in the 2nd century, so this isn't from the Bible, it's from other historical documents. And this account of it says, Polycarp's greatest contribution to Christianity may be his martyred death. His martyrdom stands out as one of the most well-documented events of antiquity. The emperors of Rome had unleashed bitter attacks against the Christians during this period, and members of the early church recorded many of the persecutions and deaths. Polycarp was arrested on the charge of being a Christian, a member of a politically dangerous cult whose rapid growth needed to be stopped. Amidst an angry mob, the Roman proconsul took pity on such a gentle old man and urged Polycarp to proclaim Caesar is Lord. If only Polycarp would make this declaration and offer a small pinch of incense to Caesar's statue, another statue. If he did, he would escape torture and death. To this Polycarp responded, 86 years I have served Christ, and he never did me any wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? Steadfast in his stand for Christ, Polycarp refused to compromise his beliefs, and thus he was burned alive at the stake. Our prayers are not a way of controlling God. We can't do that. Our prayers are a way of laying our lives before him, handing things over to him, believing and trusting that ultimately he knows best, and wanting him to dictate what happens, whatever that means. And yes, we should pray passionately about what we believe is good and right, in love for ourselves and for others, and in faith. But we must leave it in God's hands to decide how those prayers will be answered. We should have that much confidence in him, as Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego clearly did. Knowing he can do great things, he can do seemingly impossible things sometimes, but he won't always answer as we ask. I don't have any great explanation for you as to why things are like that. I simply know from the Bible and from life's experience that is the fact, that is the truth, that on one occasion God will answer our prayers in quite remarkable fashion, and on other occasions we don't receive what we ask for. But what we do is we keep on praying, believing God always hears our prayers, always does act, and believing that our prayers always bring a blessing of some kind on our lives or the lives of others we're praying for. But it's in God's time and it's in the way that God sees fit. But there is one thing we know that will be the case in all situations. And that's that promise again, that he will be with us in absolutely everything. And when the occasion demands it, he'll make that very apparent to us, as he did in that furnace, as he did to Charlotte in prison in Iran. Which is my third point. Coming back to the fact that this is a really dramatic illustration of God's promise to be with us in everything. Jesus gave us exactly the same promise, didn't he? The end of Matthew's Gospel, and surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. And with Jesus, we not only get the promise from him, but we get the promise from one who has prayed himself earnestly in a life and death situation. When we remember what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus was there on his knees praying desperately that he might not have to go to the cross. That's what he was praying. 3 times he went to pray that. And yet he also prayed, but Father, your will be done. And instead of being released from that dreadful prospect, he was strengthened to face that prospect. And through his suffering, God brought out incredible good for all of us. God knew what he was doing even in that situation. I don't know whether you've been watching much of the TV coverage of the Olympics, but there's one thing I keep hearing from medal winners. And it's about this 4-year period and the way that they've been so dedicated, so rigorous in their training regime. Every day for 4 years I've been training and concentrating on this. For a few minutes, for many of them in the Olympics, to perform my best when I get to that moment. And it seems to me there's a great analogy here with our Christian lives. You see, in the book of Daniel, we see these incredible miracles and we think, how can this be possible? But there's only a handful of things here. There's 4 or 5 stories that are amazing. The rest of their lives, I reckon life went on pretty much like it does for you and me. It was ordinary stuff, but I'm pretty sure that they were very disciplined and rigorous day by day in their faith, praying, studying God's word, worshipping, so that they learned that God was with them in everything. That in the little things they learned that he was real, that he was with them, that he heard and did answer their prayers. So that they learned to trust him, so that when the crises came on that rare occasion, well, they were ready. They had that confidence in God. They knew he wasn't going to abandon them. That they could trust in him, whatever happened. And it's the same for us. We will only be ready for those major crises in life if day by day we're sharing our lives with him, learning how faithful he is, that he is always with us. So our confidence grows and we truly believe he's with us in everything, both now and forever, because that is the other point, isn't it? And I close by reminding you once again about God's long-term plans. We were looking at that last week in terms of his long-term plans for the world as a whole, but also for us as individuals. Because ultimately, going back to my comment on that verse from Isaiah, saving souls is his business. That is his priority. And if that means that in this life he allows us to go through times of anxiety and suffering, well, I believe that sometimes that is a pathway that's required to achieve his ultimate goal of saving our souls and those around us. Sometimes through our suffering we're helping others in some way. And we can trust him for that. And we can trust him in his promise to be with us in everything, to protect us where it matters most, and to give us the strength we need to face all that life brings to us. Confident that whatever befalls us, his presence will be with us and will continue on into eternity.